All right, this is Openstax U.S. History, Chapter 23, Americans and the Great War, 1914 to 1919. We'll be looking at Section 1, American Isolationism and the European Origins of War. So this chapter is about the Great War, otherwise known as the First World War, or World War I. Of course, we refer to it as these two today only because there was a World War II. At the time, there had only been one World War, so they just simply called it the Great War. It stretched from 1914 to 1919, roughly 5 years or so was how long the war went on for. So initially, the United States took a policy of isolationism, that is to remain out of the conflict for European affairs. However, it's going to inch itself towards the conflict. The United States entry into the war, at least direct entry, is in 1917. So the war had already been going on, or the war goes on for a couple of years before the United States becomes formally involved. Now, the president at the time is Woodrow Wilson. Of course, this is coming off the back of U.S. imperialism, which pretty much which more or less dominated foreign policy from, the 1870s or so till about 1914. And that, of course, was the quest for empire, the Spanish-American War, etc., etc. Wilson, when he comes to power following William Howard Taft, wants to promote a much more idealistic version of U.S. foreign policy. One good example is how he appoints William Jennings Bryan to be the Secretary of State. That is the position who deals with foreign policy with other nations. And he was an anti-imperialist. Two of the ways in which the United States exercised control around the world: dollar diplomacy, which was pretty much getting nations to become indebted to you. It was used in Central America by William Howard Taft. The Roosevelt Corollary, which more or less allowed the United States to become more aggressive in terms of dealing with Latin America and the Western Hemisphere. Woodrow Wilson really moved away from these things. In terms of his idealism, what Wilson wanted was kind of less involvement, right? So this was his idealism. However, there was also a reality of foreign policy, and that was Wilson oftentimes was forced to intervene in other countries, even though he really didn't want to. And a good example of that was Mexico. In Mexico, there was essentially a civil war going on, and the United States, in order to promote the U.S. interest in Mexico, actually sent troops to Veracruz, where U.S. and Mexican troops did battle. So despite the fact that Wilson wanted to kind of shy away from involvement in Latin America because the U.S. wanted to promote its side in this civil conflict in Mexico, the U.S. sent troops and captured the city of Veracruz. This led to Pancho Villa, who was on the side of Mexico. He led raids into U.S. territory. And as a response, the U.S. sent troops into Mexico to go and try and capture Pancho Villa. So the fact that Wilson had an idealistic point of view, wanted to, again, kind of stay out of global involvements, but the reality was that it couldn't always work all the time. Now, of course, Wilson's position on imperialism aside, by far the most important part in this chapter is when war breaks up in Europe. And initially when war breaks out in 1914, Wilson does want to remain neutral. All right, that is the position. However, let's talk a little bit about how war broke out in Europe in 1914, just really quickly. So even though the war broke out in this year, there were long-term causes leading up to the First World War. Again, this is a massive conflict that really the world had never experienced before, but there were several long-term causes. There were, quote unquote, what your textbook calls side treaties, or these are treaties or alliances. And what alliances allow for is that, alliances allow for a small conflict to turn into a large conflict when nations are allied with each other. The Triple Entente consisted of France, Great Britain, and Russia, which were allies. We might also add Serbia to this equation because they were tied up with Russia. The Central Powers, another alliance group, consisted of Germany, Austria-Hungary, and the Ottoman Empire. And what this allowed for was a minor conflict between Serbia and Austria-Hungary. That's how World War I begins, as a conflict between those two nations. It then brings in other countries because they are fighting their allies or fighting their friends. So the alliance system helped turn a small conflict into a big conflict. Militarism was also a big build-up to this conflict. That is, nations building and spending on their militaries, which all nations did. Again, makes nations a little bit more eager maybe to use military force. You had all of them competing for overseas empire, that is imperialism, right? That all these nations, Russia, Germany, Great Britain, were all fighting for overseas territories. By 1914, not a lot of land left to claim. And so you could have imperial ambitions also be one of the causes of this war. And lastly here, you have nationalism, that is pride in one's nation, which of course all these countries had, right? All Germans were proud to be German, and all French people were proud of France, etc., etc. And so with all these things working in the background, right, all these things kind of working in the background, it took the assassination of the Archduke Franz Ferdinand. So this was the prince in Austria-Hungary. So he was going to be the next emperor. He was assassinated. And he was assassinated by Gavrilo Princip, right? So that is the assassin, who was a Serbian nationalist. And that's because the country of Austria-Hungary right here and Serbia, in Austria-Hungary, you had a lot of Serbians who were ruled over by that state. And so the thinking was that if we, kill the Prince of Austria-Hungary, that will lead to more independence for Serbia. And when that happened, then the alliance system began to kick in. So Serbia assassinates the Prince of Austria-Hungary. Maybe we'll use a different color here, maybe green. So Serbia assassinates the Prince of Austria-Hungary. The Serbian government denies it. Austria-Hungary is not buying it. So Austria-Hungary declares war on Serbia. Russia, which is Serbia's ally, begins to mobilize troops against Germany. Russia and France are allies. So Germany prepares by attacking France and attacking Russia essentially at the same time. And then Great Britain is also caught into this conflict. So it's just a ginormous mess with how this unfolds. But it eventually does unfold. And by 1914, pretty much all of Europe is in conflict. Now, the Great War, as it was called, had some unique characteristics. The type of fighting was trench warfare. So this is kind of very what we might call stagnant fighting. Not a lot of movement in terms of either side being able to advance on the battlefield. Trenches are essentially man-made holes in the ground. And that was because the new technology was so deadly that the only way that one could avoid dying was simply by digging holes into the ground and taking cover. New technologies really made this conflict something else. So these were all kind of new weapons that were being used. Machine guns, again, that were so deadly that one could only simply, again, hide in the ground to get away from it. You had tanks, which were new weapons. Airplanes, which had never been used before on a battlefield, being used for the first time. Barbed wire, which made attacking pretty much impossible. and poison gas, right? Which was also chemical warfare. I'm not sure if that's how you spell poison, but whatever. Which was a version of chemical warfare. So all these things made warfare incredibly deadly. You had anywhere from 10 million military deaths, which was the deadliest war up until that time, 6 million civilian deaths, disease, starvation. And, this went on for, 4 years. So it was the deadliest and most brutal conflict that had ever broken out. Now, the United States, again, is staying out of this for the most part. It really doesn't want any part of this conflict. However, it's difficult for the U.S. to remain neutral. Another new technology and here's where we begin to see how the U.S. becomes involved. Another new technology is the U-boat or submarine. Now, German U-boats, and again, Germany is on the Central Powers side, right? So this is the side that they're on. German U-boats were ordered to sink any ships that were handling or going into Great Britain. Great Britain is an island nation. And among those was the Lusitania, which was sank by a German U-boat, but also had 128 Americans on board. And it's when Americans are getting killed on ships going to Great Britain by submarines that's really what the United States objects to. And so when this German U-boat or submarine sinks the Lusitania, which is a British ship, but kills 128 Americans that were on board, that's when Americans really become angry with Germany. Here you can see a picture of the Lusitania and a propaganda poster saying, "Remember the Lusitania, enlist today." Now again, President Woodrow Wilson's position was neutrality. He does not want the United States to get involved in this war because the U.S. isn't really directly involved. However, during the 1916 presidential election, Wilson knows that his risk or his chances of winning aren't great. And so even though he remains neutral, he does pass 2 laws that allow for preparation, right? Just in case. Preparation. The National Defense Act allows the United States to raise an army. And the Naval Appropriations Act allows the U.S. to expand the Navy. All right, so there is a military preparation taking place. His slogan, though, is "He kept us out of war," right? So this is Wilson's 1916 presidential slogan. And with this slogan, "He kept us out of war," Wilson wins the 1916 election. So he is reelected on the promise of keeping the United States out of war. So for the most part, most Americans are okay and endorse a neutral position. But there are a couple of things that proceed in the next year, events, that begin to push the United States more into the war, but specifically more on the Entente side, right? So the Triple Entente is right here. It consists of France, Great Britain, and Russia, specifically Great Britain. The first one of those things is trade. The U.S. trades more to Great Britain, right? More to Great Britain. They loan, right? Loans more money. And if you're a U.S. bank and you're loaning to Great Britain, if you want to get paid back, you want the side that you're loaning to win. Great Britain had effectively blocked Germany off from trade. So in terms of where are the dollars, the United States had an economic interest in the Allies winning the war, specifically Great Britain, the Triple Entente. They'll later on be called the Allies because that's what side the U.S. joins. Ethnically speaking, the United States was divided. So for example, those who were Anglo, and those are most people in government, they would favor the British side. But if you were German, if you were Irish, if you were Jewish, right, you might actually favor the Central Powers, right, in this. And that was because the Irish have a problem with the British. The British don't treat the Irish very well. The Russians never treated the Jews very well. So, you know, ethnically speaking, the United States could be divided depending on what ethnic background that you had. But again, most of those working in the government are Anglo, English speaking. They tend to side more a little bit with Great Britain. The major thing that gets the US really, I would say, probably the furthest away from a neutral position into the conflict is Germany's decision to use unrestricted submarine warfare. That is Germany's willingness to sink US ships, despite the fact that the United States is not in this conflict. Essentially what Germany said was, any ship looking to get to Great Britain, the Germans are going to sink it. It doesn't matter if it's an American ship or whatever ship that it belongs to. And with that policy, American ships are starting to be sunk by Germany. And that's really what pushes the US out of this neutral position, this willingness by Germany just to use submarine warfare with no restrictions on it whatsoever. To add insult to injury, the United States discovers the Zimmermann telegraph, which is a telegraph message, we might say alliance, from Germany to Mexico. Germany thinks that perhaps the United States might get in on the conflict and might get in on the conflict on Great Britain's side. So this is like insurance. What do they want? They want Mexico essentially to attack the United States. Germany promises that Mexico can have the territory back they lost to the United States in the 1840s. Mexico is not really in any position to help Germany in this context. Mexico is going through a civil war of their own. However, it just pisses off the Americans even more. And finally, with that, that's kind of like the cherry on top. President Woodrow Wilson goes to the U.S. Congress, asks for a declaration of war. Congress votes yes, although there are some reservations. There are some in the U.S. Congress that do not want to see the United States enter into this conflict. But in 1917, among the Triple Entente, right, and there's actually a couple of things that occurred here. Russia actually bows out of the conflict. They go through what's called the Russian Revolution. But by 1917, United States, we would refer to as these three powers: France, Great Britain, and the United States. We'll call them the big three allies, right, in World War I. And they, of course, are fighting against Germany, Austria-Hungary, and the Ottoman Empire. And this is only after 1917 when the United States joins the conflict.